All right, I am Nikki Actipis, and this is my Module 3 assignment. And I talked about, or what I'm going to talk about, is conflicting rights within schools. So, what is free speech, hate speech, and endangerment? And this really ties into my discussion post for the same module. And it's also something near and dear to my heart, and I think it is to a lot of people in the United States. But as somebody who is a social justice advocate and a big proponent of the separation of church and state, um, I thought this was just a good one to go with for me. So hopefully I do the two cases that I'm about to present you some justice and give you some of my feedback on these cases and where I kind of see things going in the current state of affairs. So, like I said, we're going to be talking a lot about the First Amendment. So, what I wanted to do was start off by exactly stating what the First Amendment says. And it states that Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or arbitrating, abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So that is what is written into the Bill of Rights. And as we may or may not know, the Bill of Rights came long after the Constitution. It was when there was like, oh crap, there was some stuff that we left out. We need to somehow make sure that our citizens are getting their human rights. So, what does all of this translate into? So, for the most part, people have a pretty basic understanding of what the First Amendment is really talking about. And I thought I would break it down a little bit more here, just because it's good to have that on the top of your brain while thinking about all the rest of the stuff. So, for the most part, the First Amendment really is talking about the whole federal government. So it's stated directly in the Bill of Rights in the First Amendment. It stated Congress, but it was later interpreted that that means the whole federal government. So that means, Supreme Court, the presidency, all of that um, can infringe upon these specific rights. State by state case, that's for a different time, different topic. So we're talking about the whole federal government here. And overall, the First Amendment is saying that there cannot be an established official religion of the United States, or any religion can't be given preference. So this really upholds, or is supposed to uphold, this idea of the separation of church and state, that, yeah, you can have your own personal religious beliefs, but don't bring them into government, which again, different topic for a different time. And the government itself needs substantial justification to interfere with the right of free speech. So this means that there must be some really big imminent threat. There has to be substantial proof, all of that good stuff. It can't just be like, well, you said something nasty about the president. I don't like it. We're shutting it down. It's not what the government can be up to, the federal government at least. And then finally, the First Amendment talks about allowing peaceful protest. Um, and again, we could debate on what peaceful protest means, how we want to interpret that now. But it means if you've got grievances with something going on in the universe, you are allowed to peacefully assemble and protest. Show the world what you're trying to get changed. So my question that I wanted to pose was pretty basic, and it was about schools and the First Amendment. So where is the line between religious freedoms, free speech, hate speech, and endangerment? I don't really touch too much about religious freedoms here. It's more about free speech, hate speech, and endangerment. But we might go over how this all connects to religious freedoms and all of that here towards my conclusion. So I picked two relatively kind of in the dustbin cases. They were ruled on by the Supreme Court, but spoiler ahead of time, both of these cases, the Supreme Court ruled to uphold the lower courts, which means that students in these cases were ruled against. And we'll see why that is. So these two cases are often cited side by side. That's why I chose both of them at once. They're not quite the same, but they have the same outcome. So we have Bethel School District versus Fraser in 1986. That's when it was decided. And then we have Hazelwood School District versus Kulumiri. I'm probably saying that wrong, but you know, it is what it is. And that case was in 1988. So again, like I said, spoiler, the court rules uphold lower courts in both these rulings, but these cases are still important to talk about. So the content, like I said earlier, varies between these two cases, but they have kind of the same outcome. So the first case in 1986 with the Bethel School District, for the most part, it was a student got up to nominate another student for student body council, and their speech was riddled with sexual innuendos. There was no quote unquote obscene language in it, no F-bombs dropped, no bodily anatomy mentioned, no sex organs mentioned, whatever may have qualified as vulgarity at that point. But he did this whole speech that just talked about, and it's on the screen. I wouldn't do it justice if I read it, so I'm not going to read it out loud. But do yourself a favor, read it. You'll probably have a chuckle. But maybe if you were the school superintendent of this district, you might not have a chuckle or whatever. But the student question got up and made all these innuendos about that this other student could sexually gratify people, but not really. That's not really what he meant, whatever. And he got suspended from school for 3 days, I believe, if I remember correctly. And the student came back and said, "Hey, me and my family are suing you. Like, that's not cool." School is like, "Well, that was obscene. You can't do that. So we have the right to suspend you," and all that fun stuff. And obviously, it went up to the Supreme Court, which we'll talk about here in a second. The second case, however, with Hazelwood School District, is more about a school publication in which there were some articles written about an interview with a student whose parents recently divorced. And there was another article about teen pregnancy, interviewing a few students that had been pregnant. Everybody's names were redacted from the articles. There were no identifying markers or whatever of who these people could be. So the school journalist took safety and care in that measure. But the principal decided that these things weren't appropriate to be in a high school student publication, and was cited also saying concern for the identities of these students, that even though their names and stuff were taken out of the articles, that students would still be identified. And also that it just wasn't appropriate to talk about these topics in school, because obviously nobody, one, has premarital sex, and two, divorce is a sin. You know, whatever floats your boat, right? So the principal removed these articles before the publication hit print, which caused an uproar of saying, "Hey, like, you didn't even consult us about this. You're censoring us and all of that stuff, and we're going to sue you. And so that went up through the courts to the Supreme Court. And before I move forward, I don't remember if I stated this or not. These are both public school districts, so these are both federally and locally funded. So that's a little bit different. That's another reason why I picked them, because that might be a little bit different than maybe a private school. So yeah, just keep that in mind as well. Both of these are public school. Nobody's saying dropping any F-bombs or S-bombs or anything like that. It just seems one's a little childish, one maybe just the content was heavy. So obviously to every story, there's more than one side. So in both cases, the school said the students were being disruptive, that obviously the speech involving sexual innuendos at a ceremony or assembly was disruptive because kids were probably giggling or hooting and hollering, whatever. The school, or such as with the newspaper articles, that it might be disruptive because, oh, well, cause gossip because who was pregnant, whatever, if people didn't know, all of that stuff. So in both cases, the school districts argued that these actions of the students were disruptive. They also argued that the actions of the students were endangering the whole student body. So one being subjected to sexual innuendos in the first case, and in the second case, talking about teenage pregnancy. So obviously you could end up talking about sex. And then divorce, well, some people might be upset by divorce, right? And the schools also overall were just saying that these actions by these students were vulgar. And vulgarity has its limit within schools. On the other side, you have the students that they were saying in both cases that the punishments were violations of their free speech, and they shouldn't be kept from their free speech even though they're at school, they're in a public school, and they're not physically endangering anybody and all of that. And then students also said, especially in the case of the school paper, that they weren't consulted about adjusting their speeches or their writings or whatever. And the young man at the time who had the school speech said, well, nobody pulled me off stage, so why was this a problem? So you've got both sides of the stories there. You can see students, these are high school students, so they're standing up for their rights. They feel like they're in the right by expressing themselves. And the school district is saying, well, wait a second. We need to protect you. We need to not only protect your rights, but everybody else's rights in these buildings and all that good stuff, right? So when thinking about these two cases, well, first off, let me say, so the Supreme Court in both cases upheld lower court rulings that said the students were in the wrong and that there were limitations of free speech within the classroom because of, these things could have caused disruptions or caused hurt feelings, whatever. So in both cases, the Supreme Court was like, no, students were in the wrong here. The school had every right to censor them in such a way. And to, in the case of the young gentleman talking about his friend being sexually adequate, he was suspended. He was kicked out of school for a few days. So overall, analyzing these, I think it's important to recognize that both cases were decided in the late 80s. So they obviously took place earlier in the 80s. I think one of them said 83, maybe the other one was 86. So you got to think about what was happening in the 80s, what we were feeling about our own sexualities, what we were thinking about when it came to divorce and culturally, what divorce meant and what teen pregnancy meant in those aspects. So that was something I really thought about when thinking about these cases. And then I thought a lot about what is the ethical obligations to take other action first. So besides just suspending kids or pulling publications without consent of the kids or without any discussion from the with the students and all of that. So what is our obligation, my obligation as teacher, everybody else's obligations as teachers, administrators, all of that, to find other remedies besides just acting and saying, hey, I'm the adult here. I get the last say. I don't have to explain myself. And then next, I thought about what evidence did these school districts have that showed the actions of these students were endangering the whole student body? Like, who had evidence that somebody talking about their friend being able to be erect was endangering everybody else in that audience? Or was it just making them personally feel uncomfortable? Or what evidence do they have that students were going to get a hold of the pregnant teenagers' names and harass them or pick on the person who they found out had a divorced parent and all of that? So what evidence was there that these schools presented to help their cases instead of just saying, whoa, I think it's offensive, so it must be offensive and it must be hurting somebody else? And then how do you define what is offensive? So this is a very perplexing question. Um, and I guess it really depends on culturally what you find offensive. I think there are some standards that most of us can agree upon what's offensive. Maybe not. Um, like personally, I would find it offensive if somebody put something on my pizza that I didn't want, such as maybe some sardines. Is that offensive to anybody else? Maybe, but is it offensive to everybody? No. So how do we create those standards of what is offensive and what is not offensive? And I really had to think about that with these cases. And then finally, I thought about when I was analyzing these two cases, the context of words and how they change over time. Um, I can't speak for the 80s. I wasn't around. I was only around for a year in the 80s. But I can speak to the 90s and obviously 2000s and the 2020s. In my lifetime alone, the context of words have changed dramatically, and quote unquote offensive words that used to be offensive aren't offensive anymore, and words that weren't offensive at one point can now be offensive, and all these weird intermittent gray areas, right? So I know I have my slide here about conclusions, but I want to talk about them in terms of my analysis. So overall, I found both these. Well, I found the first case about the young gentleman getting up and making basically dick jokes for what I assume was about a 5-minute speech to be hilarious. And second of all, how obviously, how do I put this? Obviously, somebody later on, some other faculty member later on had to explain, at least I'm imagining in my head, had to explain what the student was talking about in his speech. Because I don't feel like administrators right off the bat knew what he was saying. Because I feel like they wouldn't have let it continue. Because nowhere that I read said, oh, well, he was cut off. So I'm going to say right there, part of the onus of that being potentially endangering to the student body is on the administrators for not recognizing a dick joke when they heard one. So honestly, that is on them. They had control over that situation and they did not do well. So I feel like there was just punishment dealt out uh, because they felt like they had been bested, which I feel like in a lot of situations with teachers, that's often how it happens. To be like, oh, well, I didn't catch that the first time, but somebody's explained it to me. So now you're in trouble. And now I'm going to use backpedal and use all of these rules and regulations to restrict whatever you're saying. And then in the second case, I feel like pulling the articles was not the best choice because it didn't give them a chance to create dialogue surrounding teen pregnancy and divorce, all of things of which teenagers go through, plus more. I see that that could have been a learning experience. I understand at the time in the 80s, maybe those were a little bit more taboo. I still feel like those are pretty taboo things to talk about in our culture now. But just because it makes you uncomfortable doesn't mean it's harmful to everybody. And it doesn't mean that it's vulgar or obscene. So, anyways, so what has changed since these cases were ruled upon? So, after doing a little bit of digging, these cases are still being upheld, even though it's been over 30 years. And it seems like we're just kind of upholding old standards, in my opinion. Because nowadays we're trying to move towards teaching our kids social emotional skills. We're trying to work in schools about informed trauma and teaching in an informed trauma way and having those spaces. And I think restricting free speech within schools surrounding certain topics that older staff members might find atrocious, such as divorce and teen pregnancy, is not helping anybody. It is helping perpetuate a problem that we have. So we shouldn't be censoring that in schools. And then on the topic of suspensions, so you pulled a kid out of school for 3 days for talking about somebody else's junk. That was more of a break for the school staff than it was to actually teach the kid a lesson. And now the kid is farther behind in schoolwork if he was behind before that. And you're not really having a conversation. So what else can be done besides just hopping right to suspension, right? When there's conflicting views between rights and what is legally obligated of a school. And then who gets to decide what is lewd or endangering to students? When thinking back again to the kid who did the speech, that is exactly what a high schooler is going to do. How did you not know that? I'm sorry. I personally don't find that lewd. I feel like my school administration that I work with, maybe a few of them would find that to be lewd and be like, hey, like, we're going to have a conversation about how you don't make this a public event. But I don't think anybody's going to be like, don't say those things. Maybe in more conservative areas, what's lewd is a little bit more stringent. And maybe what's endangering students is different, such as currently there's, to bring up current events, this idea around how teaching critical race theory is endangering the students. And so we might see a case here soon that students are talking about race in the classroom and they get punished. And we go through this whole Supreme Court case. And that will define what's endangering students then again, and if talking about race is lewd. Um, so it really perplexes me on what is decided to be lewd or endangering to students. And then culturally, how does our culture play into all of this? So how does our culture play into how our laws are made and how they're revised based on cultural shifts? Um, and I'm not quite sure to how to even to word this or to handle it, um, because our laws and our cultures don't always add up. And it's this weird cognitive dissonance that I'm still trying to wrap my head around, not just for this assignment, but in life in general. And then lastly, both of these instances should have been made into learning opportunities instead of students getting in trouble or their work being not published at all. Um, these were good conversation starters. And I think in the 80s and even today, we leap to punishments quicker than we do trying to, have discussions about things, which is, it is what it is, right? So hopefully some or all of that made sense, or maybe at least one sentence. But I did enjoy this particular activity, even though I'm still a little bit perplexed on if I did it correctly. But we'll see. Thank you for listening.